Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Medley, and we're going to talk about Article 2. This is a quick one. Again, if you hear my dog Beignet barking, I apologize for that. He's not in the kennel. We're going to see how it goes. So, this article is interesting because it's not necessarily measuring the behaviors of individuals with adults with autism. It is measuring the staff or the educators in this sense and how well they responded to an intervention for them to do their protocols better with people who have autism. Now, you may or may not have a lot of familiarity working with individuals with autism, especially adults, but we're going to talk a little bit about what that means. So in this study, they're using technology, FaceTime specifically, to really give feedback to the educators who are working with individuals with autism. And so ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is a lifelong disability. And there's three big areas that are concerning for individuals that have ASD. One is impaired communication. That communication can be verbal or nonverbal communication. So that means getting the information in, so watching other people and learning from that communication, or giving the communication out. So both of those are concerning in those areas, and some people are better at one than the other. Both have significant deficits in both. There's also social impairments. And so interacting, that's the giving out, or learning from social situations. And then stereotyped and repetitive behaviors. So behaviors that are different from norm, basically. And we have a really high population. When I first entered the world of education, it was as a special educator, and autism was considered a low frequency disability. And now it's not. It's really a high frequency disability. It happens really commonly. It gives you some statistics in here. But as you can see, it says in the article, 1 in 68 children at the time were identified with ASD. This is becoming more and more. And we're seeing that individuals who are children turn into adults with ASD. And so we want to see services that start to understand what's going on with autism and serve that population really well, as we see higher percentages or rates of ASD, autism spectrum disorders, in our adult populations as well. So some highlighted areas in here as you go through, really kind of looking at what is autism, if that's new for you. And we'll have some videos up to kind of help explain that as well. But thinking about how could autism be a barrier as me, an adult educator, or working in adult education or designing adult education in that world, how can we serve those individuals well? This is one option to make sure that the individuals who are working with your clientele, your population of adult learners have access to things. And so it talks about individuals with ASD not necessarily being in a traditional learning environment after age 21. And it may be libraries, restaurants, exercise facilities, offices, hospitals, movie theaters. And those kind of staff may need more training as well, in addition to adult education kind of areas. So then it kind of gives us some background about applied behavior analysis, and it being an area where instructors who are working with adults with autism spectrum disorder can really learn a lot and be effective, because it's got a really strong research base as being successful in that area. So strategies from applied behavior analysis that are really helpful can be things like positive reinforcement, shaping behaviors once you've got one behavior, building on it and changing it, chaining, that is adding on behaviors. Once you've learned one, you can add on little bits of it until it becomes a pattern all the way through, and you can do a full process of a behavior. And then prompting procedures. So having really structured prompting can be very, very helpful to get the desired response that you'd like. So, staff training, there's lots of information out in the world of staff training. Some of the words that you may see in this article are things like fidelity or integrity. What they're saying is that we want to make sure that whatever we went out to do in our protocol with an individual, saying, this is what I'm going to do, these are the specific steps I'm going to take, this is how I'm going to set up the environment, whatever I'm doing, I'm going to do it exactly the way I said I was going to do it. And so a lot of times we have checklists for ourselves in those situations. And that's exactly what happened in this article, is that they had behavioral skills training and performance and competency-based training for their staff. And they had a checklist that they went through and said, here's the checklist. We want to make sure that it's really robust, but also very simple. And so then they did an intervention to see if they could get better results. And so you can see that there's different staff protocols out there. It talks about those. It talks about doing video feedback. And that's been something that's been around in the literature for a long time. But one of the hiccups that we have with somebody coming in and doing any kind of feedback for somebody who's teaching or educating is that your clients might react. And we call that reactivity. And so doing video based or something where the client isn't necessarily fully aware of the presence of the observer who's observing, again, the staffer, not them, might be really helpful to us because, again, we don't want to interfere with the education that's going on, but we do want to make sure that we're doing whatever our protocols are really, really well. So it goes into distance technology information out there. I'm sure that you know about Skype and FaceTime. As our technology stuff has gotten better and better, there are options out there. And so what they did is they used FaceTime, and they picked that they wanted to have their participants that were 3 staff members with 3 adults who were served by a local education kind of agency for adults. And all of their staff had at least a high school diploma. They had done training in what they were supposed to be doing, so those protocols. And they needed help, meaning that they weren't doing the protocols well. So they wanted them to be above 80% fidelity. So they wanted them to comply with 80% of those steps or better in that protocol. And they weren't. So that's how those 3 got chosen in here. So they did a 90-day training about ABA, about prompting, about those basic kind of principles, working with individuals with autism spectrum disorders. And they successfully had passed sort of a competency test assessments in that area. They were scheduled to meet with their individual who was an adult participant at least twice a week. And they had a different range of experience. So some had 6 months up to 3 years of working with individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And the participants lived within an hour of the agency. They were fairly young, so 22 to 28 years old. And the adult participants were all female, 20 to 27 years old. So some of them had they all had autism spectrum disorder and intellectual disability. So they were functioning sort of below average in that area of intellectual behaviors. And that also means that they have adaptive skill behaviors, that is sort of skills of daily living, those kinds of things. So one of the personal skills they were working on was flossing, teeth brushing, personal care skills, those kinds of things. And then some communication and vocational skills as well. And they had some other daily living things like workout routines, meal prep, laundry, chores. And so those are really important life kinds of things that maybe adult education facilities or education agencies might be helpful with, as well as community providers. So here's the checklist itself. So you see the fidelity checklist. It's really simple. Did they set up the environment well? Did they present feedback? Did they mark each step as they were going on? And the intervention itself. Did they immediately respond to a correction that was given to them over whatever was needed? Did they use the specific social praise every step, every 1 to 3 steps that were independent? And did they mark each step that they were going on there? And so they would just have to mark a plus or minus. The case manager would do that while they were kind of observing what was going on, whether it was video or not. So the dependent variable is the number of steps they did right. So they converted that to a percentage. And so it's really fairly simple. You can see that it's a very simple kind of protocol that they had going on there. So we will go and scroll down to show you exactly what happened. So this chart, if you're not familiar really with ABA, I can explain it a little. You see it's got 3 different horizontal lines. And so this horizontal line, that indicates that this is one staffer all the way across. And their baseline for the percentage of steps they were doing kind of hovers around 50%. So it's getting about half the steps done. Again, we want to have 80% or better is what they kind of set as their marker. And that's a really common marker. Of course, 100% would be great, but nobody's going to be 100% all the time. And so you see this little dotted line tells us that the intervention has started with them. So they started that FaceTime video feedback at that point. And you can see that it went up. So they've got up from about, oh, let's see, 60% all the way up to 100 over here. And then we see our second staff member down here. And they were kind of hovering maybe around 30% or so, somewhere around there. And then once the intervention started here, they immediately went up and they kept going up. And so then we see our third staffer here, again, 40-50%, somewhere around there. And then they started later than the others. As you can see, they in time, they started much later. And so after 15 sessions somewhere is where they started. And they went up and they kept going up. And so that's an interesting response. Another part of the data that they presented was percent of non-overlapping data. P&D is what we call it. So P&D data said that the percent of non-overlapping data is 100%. That's just comparing these markers to these markers. Do they overlap at all? No, they don't. So what it's telling us is that the intervention had an immediate swift change. So all of these interventions appear to work. And so it's the intervention of having a FaceTime person observing and giving you that immediate corrective feedback in that setting. So it's important to kind of think through, how might I use this information? What are limitations that means I can't use them for me? You may be in a setting where someone doesn't allow them to be videotaped or any of that kind of situation. It may be that it is too complicated of a protocol, or you're in a setting that doesn't have good reception for those video conferencing kinds of things just yet. Hopefully you will be, or will get it and can advocate for those situations. But technology is something that can be really helpful. And I hope this article sort of lets you know that. A lot of times we're having to use individuals and educators and staffers that are one-on-one or working with severe disabilities, and they may not have graduate degrees in how to work with autism spectrum disorders, as most people don't. And so we may want to use things like this kind of feedback that may be really, really helpful in that. All right, so if you have questions about that, let me know, and I'll get some article videos up there to support information about ASD.